Welcome everyone, I'm Grace Kuriakanja and this is Africa Matters. Now just before the annual United Nations General Assembly gets underway in New York, world leaders will try to forge a new global consensus on how to reform the UN and other global institutions so that they can tackle the challenges the world is facing today and tomorrow at the Summit of the Future. But what's in it for the African continent? Now, African countries' demands are not new, but they've never been louder. They want fair representation at the United Nations, with 2 permanent member seats at the UN Security Council, complete with veto powers, and 5 non-permanent seats. Those demands date back to the Ezuluni Consensus adopted in 2005 by the African Union. That's nearly 20 years ago. The continent is the only region without a permanent seat at the UN Security Council, even though they make up about a third of the 193 members of the UN.
It's therefore fundamentally important to address the issue of non-representation and underrepresentation of Africa in both the permanent and non-permanent categories of the Security Council, respectively. The current lack of representation in the permanent category does not reflect the current global landscape, and it is fundamental to consider the structural changes for its rectification.
All right, now the UN Security Council is tasked with maintaining international peace and security, even though its 5 permanent members, that's France, the United Kingdom, United States, Russia, and China, say they support Africa's bid for a permanent seat. They are not willing to share power.
None of the permanent members want to give up their veto power, including us. I'm being honest about that. We don't want to give up our veto power. And we do think if we expand that veto power across the board, it will make the council more dysfunctional.
Africa already has 3 non-permanent seats on the UN Security Council, allocated on a rotating basis for 2-year terms by the General Assembly. Currently, Algeria, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone are representing the continent. Now, joining us to discuss this more is Dr. Sitembile Mbete, a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. She joins us from Johannesburg in South Africa. Dr. Sitembile, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, now since the last time you addressed the UN Security Council in August this year, we've seen the US ambassador to the UN together with the 4 other permanent member states of the UNSC say that they support the expansion of the UNSC. But listen, Doc, because they say they support this expansion, including Africa representation, but with no veto power. Doc, what is a permanent member seat without veto power?
Well, you know, I think the challenge with the proposal that we've had from the US and from the other permanent members is that it basically creates a 2-tiered level, a 2-tiered structure of permanent membership, where there will be those who have not only permanent, so incumbency, as well as a veto, and then those who only have permanence. And part of the agitation by the rest of the world to expand the UN Security Council, to expand the group of permanent members in the Security Council, is partly to address the abuse of the veto by the current permanent members. And so when you create this dual, this dual membership system of those who have some rights and who have all the rights of permanent membership, and those who only have some of them, then the concern, of course, is that you just perpetuate the kind of inequality and abuse that we have seen over the last few decades.
But what Africa wants, is it just 2 permanent seats and, of course, 5 non-permanent? Is it 2 permanent seats with veto power?
So the common African position, Africa's position, is that they want 2 permanent seats with all of the advantages, with all of the rights of permanence that exists. So Africa, in principle, opposes the veto because it gives basically it violates the idea of one state, one vote, and equal rights of all member states of the UN by privileging some states with this, supercharging their voting rights by giving them the right of veto. But the African position is that for as long as the veto exists, then it should be applied equally to all permanent member states. So the African position, in many ways, really clashes with the proposals that have been made thus far, because Africa's position is that for as long as the veto exists, they would expect the African permanent members that would be included in an expanded Security Council to also have the right of veto in the same way that the current 5 permanent members do.
Right, Dr. Sitambile. But listen, because some critics, and I must say they are African critics themselves, they argue that one cannot be a permanent member with the full privilege of veto power while still being a recipient of food aid, like many African countries, while it lacks the financial muscle and intelligence gathering and so on. So does Africa have what it takes to sit at this top table or the top seat?
Yes, it does. Those critics that make those arguments, I think, downplay just how much of a contribution Africa has made to the UN Security Council and continues to make. About 25% of peacekeepers that are currently operating all over the world come from African states. African states contribute peacekeepers, and they contribute to the leadership of many of the missions of the UN. And so Africa has not been some passive recipient of aid or money or resources from the United Nations, but is actually a contributor. Several African countries also contribute to the coffers of the United Nations. And so they are, this blanketing of the whole of the continent as if it's a basket case that needs the largesse of the UN, I think masks just how many contributions come from different African states of the 54, whether that is in personnel, and the UN relies on African personnel for its peace missions because so much of the rich world refuses to put its own lives at risk, right, in peace missions. So the personnel, financial resources, as well as thought leadership on the jurisprudence of the UN, on policies, because the continent has suffered so much conflict, so much humanitarian disaster, there's things that we know better about how to address these in other contexts.
Most definitely. And you know, you've said a lot, and you've reminded me of a discussion I was having with my editor, and we agreed that, you know, this is a symbiotic relationship between Africa and the UN. And you've said that there are issues that only Africa knows how such issues can be addressed. So Africa is pushing for reforms. You, Dr. Sitambile, presented this case in front of the council. Why isn't the current United Nations setup working for Africa or for African countries?
Well, I think that there's been a great deal of progress in this debate and in the global recognition of Africa's position as a continent in global order and its ability to contribute, constructively to maintaining international peace and security. When I first started researching this area 16 years ago in 2008, it was unimaginable that there would be a US ambassador to the UN, speaking in quite decisive terms about the need to have African representation amongst the permanent members of the Security Council. So there's been a lot of progress over the last decade, and I think partly because of the very evident failures of the United Nations Security Council to address some of the most pressing conflicts of our time. So whether that is in Gaza or in Sudan or in Yemen or in Syria. And I think that that has provoked a lot of thinking around what can be done to not only make the United Nations Security Council more effective in its work, but also to maintain its legitimacy and its credibility as the premier, international organization that is tasked with maintaining international peace and security. So I think, there's been a lot of developments that have basically conspired to bring us to this moment where there's now a serious engagement and a serious discussion going on about expanding the Security Council.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sitembile Mbete there for your time and contribution.
Thank you so much for having me.
Still to come here on Africa Matters.
I am Rolling Sika Mom, and I will be revealing why some families are going to bed hungry, even though it is harvesting season in Ghana's far north.
To Ghana now, which is facing a looming food crisis after being hit by 2 consecutive disasters. First, a drought and now flooding in most of the country's main agricultural regions. Animals have died and several 100,000 hectares of farmland have been destroyed. Grain exports have now been suspended and the country is seeking assistance from the ECOWAS grain reserves. Rolling Sika Mam reports from Ghana.
This time, the drought is the worst ever and the impact is widespread and severe. Mahamadou, a farmer, is facing severe hardship. The family's only source of livelihood is a 20-acre crop farm, and it has failed once again. What remains of his previous harvest is barely enough to sustain him, his 3 wives, and 17 children until the next harvest.
I lost everything just like every farmer here. Will die of hunger if the government does not come in quickly to help.
Malnutrition is increasingly becoming a major concern. Mahamadou has to feed his children corn, stunted by the bad growing conditions.
It's a dire situation here. In almost the 11 hours we have spent in this community, we haven't seen much cooking going on. Hajara's children are among the fortunate few to have a meal today.
Most of the country's agricultural regions are affected, and farmers are counting hundreds of dollars worth of losses. Even resilient seeds could not save the situation. Livestock, which are the alternative livelihood, have also died.
Spent close to 10,000 plus on this field, and everything is gone.
The rains have finally arrived, but at the wrong time and pouring unabated. The spillage of the Bagri and Konpianga dams in Burkina Faso has worsened the situation for most farmers.
As we speak now, it's very difficult to find maize, rice maize, to processes for poultry feed, and they cannot even get the maize. There are reports even in Kumasi that the middlemen and women are scrambling with other people coming from other countries to get the maize, and they cannot even find the maize.
At the heart of the Tamale main food market, the effects of the shortage are clear. Stalls that once overflowed with produce are now nearly empty, with supplies coming in only trickles and prices skyrocketing. It's a troubling sign of the growing scarcity.
The country's government has suspended grain export and requested a bailout from the regional bloc ECOWAS grain reserves. Development experts are warning that things could get worse.
We are likely to see a lot of children drop out of school. We are likely going to see a lot of, especially girls, traveling out of their communities to work in, urban centers so they can support, their families back home.
Until the weather improves and the situation becomes more favorable for farming, Mahamadou's 17 children will go to bed with empty stomachs and their future bleak. Rolling Sika Mam, Africa Matters, Northern Ghana.
While severe drought in southern Africa and Zambia in particular is also threatening the lives of millions of people, cutting off electricity for long periods of time and damaging the country's economy. As in the rest of the world, Lusaka, Zambia's capital, depends on electricity. But ongoing power cuts and load shedding have become crippling, as Fungisai Maronga reports.
Stephen Banda, a local shoemaker, relies on electricity for 75% of his work. His business supports his family, covering school fees, groceries, rent, and clothing. Recently, power outages have become more frequent and unpredictable. The main electricity provider, Zesco, initially introduced a load-shedding schedule to help businesses plan ahead, but that is no longer reliable. Some outages last up to 20 hours a day.
In this business, now we depend on power, electricity. Like 75% of our work here, almost everything needs power. I'm a married man, I've got a family, I'm a father of three. My kids are going to school, I have to provide for them, I have to find food for them. So when there's no power, there's no electricity, it means that we are down and we can do nothing.
My workers, they are not coming to work because of the electricity. I've got a lot of challenges, and it's very difficult to book genset so that we can work. And then when you book genset, you should buy your own fuel again, so it's a lot of challenges.
Stephen and Jonathan represent many business owners struggling to keep afloat. The prolonged drought has caused water levels at Lake Kariba, Zambia's main hydroelectric power source, to fall dramatically, reducing power output from an average of 2,200 megawatts to below 1,200 megawatts. The repercussions of this energy crisis extend beyond small businesses. Investors are withdrawing and local industries are fighting for survival. While alternative energy sources like solar panels and generators exist, they come at a high cost.
Zambia as a country relies heavily on hydroelectric power, so it is prone to experiencing drought-related load shedding. And as such, it is very, very important to diversify in energy sources with solar and also improve infrastructure just to increase stability. Additionally, engaging in regional power trade helps meet supply needs for power.
The government promises a solution to the energy problem by October, focusing on resuming output at core plants, importing power from neighboring countries, and repairing the Namibian interconnector to allow more power supply.
The struggle for electricity is not just an inconvenience, it threatens the survival of small businesses and communities. How Zambia tackles this power crisis will determine the fate of small businesses, the economy, and people who depend on electricity for daily life. Fungisai Moronga, Africa Matters, Lusaka, Zambia.
To Zimbabwe next, which is rapidly becoming one of the leading blueberry producers globally. But despite the industry's growth in recent years, local farmers struggle to fund their operations as banks are reluctant to finance agricultural ventures, Irendinj reports.
Zimbabwe's favorable climate and soil conditions are making it one of the fastest growing blueberry producers in the world. Despite a growing demand, access to financing remains a major obstacle for many farmers, with most of them struggling to secure loans due to banks' reluctance to invest in agriculture, compounded by uncertainties around land tenure. Farmers like Willard Zireva have been denied funding, so he's had to rely on his own savings.
We are hoping that we can get funding next year to put in 8 hectares so that we go to 20. If we get more funding, because we are talking to various possibilities, we get more funding, we want to double the area, so to go to 24 hectares.
Despite these hurdles, Zimbabwe's blueberry industry is a bright spot in the country's horticultural exports, which now exceed $100 million annually.
We export to the UK, we have an export going to Germany for the first time. The bulk of our crop actually goes to Asia. And when I say Asia, I should be saying Far East. It goes to Malaysia, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Cambodia. Those are the main markets at the moment.
As the sector continues to grow, stakeholders also emphasize the importance of expanding the cultivation area while ensuring long-term success.
We're on 570 hectares and our tonnage is around 5,000, 6,000 tons annually. So we will see growth in the blueberry sector coming off on the tonnage side, but we really need to take advantage and grow the hectareage and maintain our market share.
The future of Zimbabwe's blueberry industry now hangs in the balance, with many farmers weighing whether to seize the opportunity or pack it in. Yarandinch, Africa Matters.
The UN says close to 282 million people in Africa were undernourished in 2023, and about 30% of children stunted because of malnutrition. To change this, Nigerian authorities have launched a code of standards that adds 4 micronutrients to bouillon or stock cubes widely used in African homes for cooking. Celine Tutar has the details.
If you are African, then you'll probably recognize these seasoning cubes, used to add flavors to particular meat dishes while cooking.
Those protein-rich meals like fish and meat are very expensive in the market and hard to find. And when we eventually find them, they are too pricey because of the cost of transporting them to the market.
So Nigeria is now experimenting with fortified nutritious cubes to help prevent a folate deficiency in children, women, and the elderly. 56-year-old Idowu knows this too well. Doctors have told her that in order to improve her health and that of her daughter, they must consume more nutrition-rich meals.
The kinds of food I eat now are eba or cassava flakes mixed with boiling water, fufu or pounded cassava, spaghetti, ponmo, which is cow's skin. And this is only because I have a son who caters for my needs since I stopped working due to my ill health.
Experts are now testing the fortification of seasoning cubes with iron, zinc, folic acid, and vitamin B12.
Fortification is important because it is the most cost-effective way of adding micronutrients that are missing in the diet for the consumer to be able to have them delivered to them through the fortified food products. It's really very important because as of today, we have micronutrient deficiencies in Nigeria, what we call hidden hunger. So one strategic approach to addressing this is through adding these micronutrients to the food that they eat.
The concept of food fortification is not foreign. Most of the salt consumed is iodized, and other basic items such as wheat flour, edible oil, and sugar are fortified with vitamin A by law. Authorities say the fortification of the bouillon cubes is the most comprehensive form of regulation to date. But for now, they are not only adding flavor, but much-needed nutrients in Idowu and her family's diet. Selin Tutar, Africa Matters.
A project in Mali to restore a centuries-old tomb faced a setback when part of the complex roof collapsed after heavy rainfall. It was a reminder of the danger faced by the tomb of Askia, built in 1495, and which is vulnerable to complex threats from the climate crisis and from Mali's political instability, as Claire Harriott reports.
The 500-year-old tomb of Askia is one of 4 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Mali. At 17 metres high, the pyramid is testament to the power and riches of the Songhai Empire, which flourished in the 15th and 16th centuries. Mamadou Samaki is in charge of the organisation that maintains the tomb. He says there are many factors degrading the site.
Water, humidity and insects are the problems we see around the tomb. There's wood that's very fragile, very degraded and broken in parts. And there were pillars that had fallen in 2011 and 2017.
Recent heavy rains caused part of the tomb's roof to collapse. Architects say the deluge was unprecedented and they're working on repairs alongside craftsmen.
There is maintenance and ongoing preservation by the management committee and by the local communities. So it's really a big project we're working on to ensure everything's done according to plan.
But threats to the site are political as well as environmental. On September 17th, armed men attacked a military training camp in Bamako. The ruling junta has expelled French forces and turned instead to Russian mercenaries for security assistance. The Tumen is 1,100 kilometres away from the scene of recent unrest in Bamako. But instability is an amplifier of the climate-related burden this ancient site already faces. Claire Herriot, Africa Matters.
That's our show this week. Share your thoughts and suggestions about the stories you've seen on this episode, or ideas on what you'd like us to cover on YouTube or on X using the hashtag Africa Matters. Thanks for watching, and it's goodbye from me, Grace Korea Kanja.